Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Application Procedure for Novel Food webinar. This is our third webinar of the webinar series organized in support to applicants and other stakeholders in the understanding of the requirements of the transparency regulation, its processes and tools. My name is Margherita Guidi. I'm the Communication Officer of the Applications Desk Unit, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Together with me, there is a team of EFSA colleagues. We have three presenters: Karine Leroux, Head of the Applications Desk Unit, Anastasia Livaniu, Scientific Officer of App Desk Unit, and Simone Gabbi, Team Leader of the Transparency and Confidentiality team. Together with us, there are also some Q&A contributors, and their names are Stefano Cappè, Sara De Berardis, Remigio Marano, Goran Kumric, and Francesca Volpi. These colleagues will be helping us out with the handling and the management of the questions that we will receive throughout the webinar. You have the opportunity to submit them via the Q&A section of the interface. And we will also have the opportunity to provide you with some answers live during the dedicated Q&A session. A bit on the webinar structure. So the presenter will go through the various phases of the application procedure for novel food. We will not go into the details of the traditional food application procedure. You can submit your questions via the Q&A feature, as I was mentioning to you. This is available on the top of the navigation menu of your interface. And the Q&A contributors will address them either in written throughout the webinar or live during the dedicated Q&A session in the last part of the webinar. So what is the goal of our webinar today? The aim is to explain the steps and the tools of the application procedure for novel food applications. We would like to mention that any questions which will remain unanswered will not be addressed after the webinar. So if you are free, if you want, you are free to resubmit them via the Ask a Question EFSA Connect tool. And we will be happy to provide you with an answer in written later on. Regarding the webinar interface, first of all, be reminded that the webinar is being recorded. It is in English language, so every question should be submitted in English throughout the webinar. And you are automatically connected to the audio broadcast on one-way audio listen mode only. And with this is very short in terms of webinar guide. If you have any technical questions, you can submit them via the chat and our IT service will support you with it. And with this one, I will now give the floor to our first presenter, the Head of Applications Desk Unit, Karine Leroux. Karine, over to you.
Thank you, Margherita, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to be able to go with you through the workflow, the life cycle of an application, and to go through this step. In the next slide, we have the basis for the life cycle of an application, and the change that we are going to present to you today is the transparency regulation that took place the 27th of March 21, based on 4 pillars that we will not detail today, but just remind: transparency, all the steps that have been done to give more transparency during the process, reliable independent studies, better governance, and effective risk communication. So the transparency regulation applies to new dossiers and applications that are submitted on or after the 27th of March. What we will see today is we will see what have been changed in the workflow, what are the tools that we are using, and we go a little in the detail for you to understand the full picture of the workflow of an application. And we are talking here about novel food application that are submitted. So we have in the phase dossier intake, you will see that we have highlighted in color the most changes. The pre-intake activities are new activities introduced by the transparency regulation the notification of study, the pre-submission advice. These are pre-intake activities that are now in the list of our catalog of service. Then we will have at the validity check a step which is a little more complete because we have other elements to check during the validity, including the notification of study, a notification list. And once the dossier is validated, we will have the publication. That is also a new element, the confidentiality, the publication of the non-confidential dossier. Assessment of confidentiality at a valid or admissible dossier is also a new element, and the consultation of the public. So you see quite some novelty in the dossier intake phase. Then EFSA will do in phase 2 the preliminary activity of the risk assessment. In the risk assessment, we will have the same steps of discussing with the working group and the panel. We might request additional information. And a novelty is that if the additional information contains confidentiality, then we will have an assessment of this confidentiality. The rest of the flow is what we used to do. So there's an endorsement by the panel, and perhaps to highlight in the fourth block, the publication of the scientific output, which is complemented with the supporting evidence that have been accumulated and presented at the end at the publication level. So this is the workflow, and we have highlighted what was new in the workflow. Now, what are the tools that have been put in place by EFSA in close collaboration with the Commission for the business operators? So you have Connect EFSA. Connect EFSA is the place where you will have access to all the pre-submission activities, the notification of study, the pre-submission advice. But you also have access anytime to services like Ask a Question, public access to document, and also where you will find the public consultation. We will go more in detail during the presentation. The e-submission food chain platform, this is a tool that as submitter in the novel food, you are lucky to be already aware and used. This is the same platform that has been used for all areas. Here you will have the dossier, submission electronically. You will receive the request for information, and you will be able to submit the information and to follow up the life cycle. Then in Open EFSA, that's the part which is open also to the public. And this is the monitoring of the risk assessment flow. This is the dissemination portal, the proactive disclosure of information. I would like to mention, but not detail, the Portalino. It's a tool that is in place. The Portalino will tackle additional data set documents that are submitted to EFSA that are not applications submitted in the electronic submission food chain and that might contain confidential information. So it's a parallel flow. We will not detail it today. Okay, so if we go in the detail now, a little more we are entering. So we have seen the workflow, we have seen the tool. The first step to access these tools that have been developed for the business operator is to register yourself as an organization, as an entity. And you can register as a business operator, future applicant. You can register as a laboratory or testing facility. Can register a third party that will work on behalf of one of you. And also we have the public, but perhaps for today we will concentrate on this part. So here what is important is that every entity has to register on their own. So they have to register as a laboratory, they have to register as an entity or a business operator. Where to go to register? This is on the portal. So in the Connect EFSA portal, we've mentioned previously, this is the place to go. On the box, the green box, register for the portal, you will be able to go there and you will be able to start your registration. You must register as a company, as an entity, and this is important. And then you will be asked to define the members of this account. So the account are on the company. We cannot have an individual name. We cannot have a functional mail. We need to have really a specific individual registered email. We have limited at the beginning the account registration to 3 members, 3 contact person per account. And now with time, since June, we have been increasing this number following the high number of requests. So the massive amount have been at the beginning handled in the few months with 3 contact points per account. Since the 30th of June, 6 persons can be registered below an account. So to highlight perhaps how the steps are done, once you register from your side, from the side of a business operator or a third party or a facility, EFSA will do a check. We'll check, we have a security check of the request, which is done in few days, and then the account is validated by EFSA. Once this is done, you have your account activated, you can populate and modify your contact person, and you can access and use all the services. To highlight here, we are since 2 months, we are in a routine mode. So in few days, this step of security and activation is done. So if you have requested access or creation of an account and it's not processed in few days, you need to contact us again. You need to contact service desk, because while at the beginning we had some massive amount of account to create, which was creating delays, since 3 months, 2 months and a half, we are really in a routine speed, and we do that in few days. Okay, update that we have done in the account registration. We have created this loop that a business operator can delegate the account to a person to act as a third party, to act on behalf of. So we have seen previously the 2 accounts are created separately, and what can do the business operator is that she can create, so here it's a she can create a relationship with a third party account, and this third party will be able to act to notify on behalf of the business operator. So this was coming from many feedback we received from the users, and we have created this in end of April. Another update that we have given is the reality is that a same person can have different account registration. She can have different roles. She can act as a business operator, or a person can act as a third party. So we have also updated here our tool since 30th of June, where a same person can define which different role it can have. We have updated with manual and videos on our portal. We have extensive explanation also on this registration that we hope will be useful for you, and we have received positive feedback on their usefulness. So we put here on these slides the link to the webinars of February and March that are giving even more detailed information. Okay, again, to repeat here, this relationship, if a third party wants to act on behalf of an applicant, the 2 of them need to be registered. Then the business operator create the relationship, and then the third party can act. Okay, we are moving now. So as an account, you have your account, you are able to enter the service we are proposing and we are offering, and we are going to detail the pre-submission activities related to new applications for the beginning. And I will not go too much in the details. I will give here the highlight, because we have very extensive webinars that have been recorded. We have user manuals that have been updated following the question we have received, detailing with screenshot all the steps. So I'm giving a highlight here. It's not the full set of information. So here the first step is to create a pre-application identification, which is the first step to do, which is based on 3 components: the subject of the application, the intended area, is it for feed, is it for food, is it for additive, and the business operator. So these are the 3 elements that characterize a pre-application ID. With this pre-application ID, you will be able to request a general pre-submission advice. So a lot of emphasis, this is a new service that can be requested to support the applicant before submitting. It's the way to gain quality of your dossier, so really use the general pre-submission advice as a tool to verify, to have more information on the quality and the doubt that you might have on your dossier before submitting. So the potential applicant has a pre-application ID and is able, through the tool, to request a pre-submission advice anytime before submission. So we have a tool where we receive this request, and EFSA will give the advice, the general pre-submission advice, which is done as a first step as a written advice, but upon EFSA decision can be done also in a virtual meeting way. Once the general pre-submission advice is given, because we are in pre-submission phase, the summary of the advice is prepared and stored. Then at step 3, while the application is valid and we have processed the application, at that moment, the summary of the pre-submission advice will be made publicly available, so will be published. This is the step that is following the transparency regulation, and you will have also details of these steps in the practical arrangement that EFSA has developed and published. So for the notification of studies, so another new activities to do, still starting in step 1 with the pre-application ID. Any actors, the applicants, the business operator, the laboratory can notify studies, and this is done in accordance with Article 32B of the practical arrangement. We have a database of notification of studies, which is not public. It's an internal database of notified studies. And in the step number 2, so first there's the notification of study. Then on step number 2, there's the submission of the application. In this context, in the context of the validation, we will check the studies that are submitted in the dossier and the studies that are submitted and notified. And then as a step number 3, at the level of validation, EFSA will publish the studies notification with the related studies, and this is done after the confidentiality decision-making process. So these are 2 elements of the new pre-application information, and that we have highlighted. Again, I would like to highlight that these are high-level elements on the process, but you have in EFSA, with the practical arrangement, with the question and answer, with the webinars that have been dedicated to each phases, you have ample information. Thank you for your attention. I'm giving the floor to my colleague Anastasia Livariu for the next step of the presentation.
Thank you, Karine. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anastasia, and today I will give you an introduction to the e-submission food chain platform, but also a short demo of the same system. So let me launch the presentation. So for some of you, as Karine already mentioned, this system is very well known since it has been operational since January 2018 for the preparation and submission of applications for novel foods and traditional foods applications. The first version was called FSCAP. But now, in light of the transparency regulation and in order to facilitate compliance for our applicants to the new transparency regulation requirements like the notification of studies or confidentiality assessment or dossier dissemination requirements, this first version, FSCAP, was extended to version 2, and this e-submission food chain platform was born. This new platform is meant to support all regulated product areas, including, of course, novel foods, that is the topic of today's webinar, excluding pesticides because they are covered from a different platform called iEuclid. This platform will serve as the single point of entry for applicants to prepare, submit, but also follow up on their applications, but also by the European Commission and Member States users to receive these applications, but also perform some risk management activities as well. At the bottom here, you will be able to find direct links to the user guide, the video tutorials that are prepared and published by the European Commission, who is developing this system, but also a link to the platform, the ESFC platform as well. And at this point, I will stop the presentation and move to the demo session. So as soon as you click on the ESFC link, you will land on the EU login page. The EU login authentication is the only prerequisite to access the e-submission platform. In the user guide, you will find very detailed instructions on how you can do so. So from the moment you authenticate, you will land on the dashboard. Obviously, if you are a new user here, the dashboard at first will be empty, but you can start building your applications. You can keep applications in draft for as long as you wish. Nobody is able to see them. You can even use this option to start familiarizing yourself with the platform. There are certain filtering functionalities as well, in case you have plenty applications that you are managing to filter and identify the one you're looking for. And you can also see the current phase of your application. So in this case, we have applications that are on hold because there was a request for information, or applications that are under risk assessment, applications that are under suitability check, and so on. At the left-hand side, you can access some support material and information, like links to the EFSA guidance documents, links to further information on the transparency regulation, and most importantly, at the bottom, you have access to the email of the European Commission support team that you can contact in case you are facing any difficulties, technical or other questions in relation to the platform while you're filling in your application, or even after that. At the top right side, we can see this button, Create New Application, which is where I will click now. And from here, you can select the application type you're interested in. So first you select the domain. So in our case, I will select novel foods, but you see here that now more areas are available. The next step is to select if my application is a novel food or a traditional food. I will select novel food. And then I will have to indicate if this is a new novel food application or a modification of an already authorized novel food. And for this webinar, I will select novel food and I will start the process. This three-step approach is the one that will eventually generate for me the template, what we also call table of contents. This is adapted for all different application types. This is adapted according to the needs of the respective scientific guidance for each one of the areas. The templates are split in three main sections. So we have the administrative data, the summary data, and the technical dossier. In the administrative data section that we are now, for the old users, it is exactly the same type of information that you had also before. So we have the identity, the name of the novel food category, information on who is the applicant, the person responsible for the dossier, but also conditions of use, labeling requirements, and so on. You might notice here some asterisks. This asterisk, of course, means that this, excuse me, this information is mandatory. And at the right-hand side, there are these question marks, and if you hit one of them, a new window pops up, and it gives you some additional information on what is expected from you to fill in these sections. So I advise that you consult them if you are in doubt on what to insert. Then in the summary data section, you're invited to submit a summary that is free from confidential information or any personal data, because here the summary will be published by the European Commission as soon as your application is received by them. Then in the technical dossier, the structure again is exactly the same as it was in FSCAP system, in the old system. Of course, following the guidance for novel foods, you can click on the different sections to expand and collapse by clicking on this plus and minus button. If for any reason one of the sections is not required for your application, you can always click on this not applicable button. But in this case, you will have to justify why this section is not applicable. Now for this, the rest of the demo, I would like to focus on items that are different compared to the old way of submitting applications. Not only for those that were using the old system, but this is applicable to all different application types with changes that are brought in because of the transparency regulation. So the first item that I would like to focus is this one on the top, which is the only section that is new compared to the old system in the technical dossier. And this refers to the pre-application information. As Karin mentioned earlier, in case you have engaged with EFSA for pre-application, pre-submission activities like requesting for pre-submission advice, or for notifying studies, you're most likely you will have a pre-application ID. So in this case, you would have to just say yes here and give the ID here below. Of course, it is possible to insert more than one, but if you don't have a pre-application ID, you just say no and you move on. In the section here below, you're invited to give the notification of studies number for the studies that, even though they were notified, you are not submitting in your application, because this is also one of the obligations according to the practical arrangements for the implementation of the transparency regulation. And again, also here you can, it is possible that you might have more than one studies that, even though were notified, were not submitted. Another aspect that is different has to do with the way of uploading documents. So once you now upload a file, of course, in every section, you're allowed to upload more than one document. So it is up to you to submit as many as it is required for each one of the sections. But as soon as you upload the documents, the system will require you to define the document type of that specific document. The document type will be selected from a list, from a drop-down list of available document types. So here are the options. So you can select from, I don't know, like technical dossier text, study report, publication, certificates, flowcharts, or other supporting documents. So let's say in this case, I have a technical dossier text, and in this other case, I have certificate of analysis. You see that the document type appears now here. Staying on the concept of document type, it is of course possible, and it is very likely in fact, that you will also submit some studies as well. So specifically for documents that refer to study reports, in the document type, you will need to select the study report option. As soon as you make this choice, the system will generate an additional set of fields that you would have to fill in. As Karin mentioned earlier, now there is this obligation that studies in support of an application, they have to be notified. So this means that as soon as I select the study report, I am required to either give the EFSA study ID number. So since I have notified my study, I can give here the respective ID number. But if my study was not notified, perhaps, for example, a study that was that had finished, that was completed already before the implementation of the transparency regulation, you would here have to also indicate the reasons why this study was not notified, because this is also an obligation from the transparency regulation. And here below, there are some additional small information to further characterize each one of the studies. The last item that I would like to focus in this demo, and is different compared to the old way of submitting application, has to do with the confidentiality requests. So now if you wish to request confidentiality for one of your submitted documents, you would have to go to this document, identify it, go to this three-dot menu at the right, click on Request Confidentiality Treatment, and immediately the status here becomes confidential. But then there are two actions that you are required to take, and they're both mandatory. The first one is to give the non-confidential file of the one you just flagged as confidential. Then the second one is to build, of course, your confidentiality request, because you cannot just indicate that this file is confidential and this is it. In order to request confidentiality, you need to define, to give first and identify the legal ground from a list of predefined legal grounds, give the justification, indicate which part of the text is the one that you are requesting confidentiality on, and then identify the location in the text. It is, of course, possible to submit more than one confidentiality request for each file, as many as you think appropriate, you think necessary. So, considering now that we have uploaded all the documents that are required for our application, we have defined the document type, we have defined all the study related information for the pre-application activities and notification of studies. We have added oral confidentiality requests as we think necessary. Now we're ready to submit. At the top right, we have the submit button. As soon as I submit, the system is running some validation checks. And this is to ensure that you are submitting a dossier that is as complete as possible. Here, you have to go to each one of them to ensure that you correct this validation error. So, for example, if you go here, you will see that it is indicating that this field was necessary and I have not provided this. So please follow all, because otherwise you will not be able to submit. From the moment I submit, and I will now go to show you an application that is already submitted. From the moment you submit, you will be able to see a page that is called Dossier Overview. In this page, you will be able to track all the different activities in relation to your application. From the moment your application was received by the European Commission, when this application was submitted to EFSA, when EFSA assigned the question number, all the way until the publication of the scientific output, but also in relation to certain risk management activities. And with this note on the page, the overview page, I will go back to the presentation to give you a few more details on what happens in your application after it arrives to EFSA, on portal updates and the validity of the application. So, as you perhaps know, your application is first submitted to the European Commission, and then the European Commission will forward the application to EFSA if risk assessment is required. In this case, EFSA will register the application in the EFSA systems, and we will assign a question number. This question number will be sent to you automatically through the e-submission platform. From the moment the question number is assigned, the question will appear and become visible on in the Open EFSA portal. Perhaps you can see here, this is an example of an already of an application that is already in Open EFSA platform. At this first stage, the only information that appears will be the EFSA question number, the status of your application. In this case, it would be under suitability check, the mandate of the European Commission, the date that your application was received in EFSA, but also the name of the applicant, who is the applicant in this case. So at this first initial phase, only this is what appears. Now the EFSA suitability check and completeness check starts. This might also include a notification of studies check if there were some pre-submission, pre-application activity. So if you have notified some studies, or if you have included studies that were not, if you have not included studies that you have notified. So here there will be a check from EFSA on this and on the discrepancies between your submission and the database. Then, following this completeness check, EFSA might come back to you with a request for missing information. This request will be received through the e-submission platform, and you will be able to both reply to this request, but also provide the additional data again through the same platform we saw earlier. If this round of requests is over and your dossier is now complete, EFSA will declare your application as suitable for risk assessment, and then the European Commission will declare it as valid. From that moment onwards, EFSA has the obligation, according to the new transparency regulation rules, to publish the non-confidential valid dossier. At this phase, we will also publish the summary of the pre-submission advice if this was requested. From the moment that the application is valid, the risk assessment can also start, but also the assessment of the confidentiality requests starts in parallel. And now I will give the floor to my colleague Simone to give you more information on confidentiality in the context of novel foods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anastasia. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am now sharing the presentation on confidentiality in the context of novel foods. Voila. I believe it should be now working. I'm here with you this morning to discuss confidentiality in the context of novel foods. It is, I have to caution indeed that what I will say this morning in this context applies specifically to confidentiality decision-making by EFSA on confidentiality requests submitted by applicants in the context of this particular regulation. Why am I indicating this? Because there are also cases where, and we will come back to this in a minute, where confidentiality decision-making is not assigned by the legislator to EFSA, but it is rather resting with the European Commission. In this event, different rules and procedures apply, and I will therefore not dwell or refer to this particular procedure for which the competence lies with the European Commission. For what concerns the competencies that EFSA enjoys in this particular field, you have already seen how in practice a confidentiality request is submitted via ESFC, which is the platform relevant for the submission of confidentiality, also of confidentiality requests in the context of novel foods. We have to indicate that everything we are saying this morning is relevant obviously for applications that are submitted after the date of applicability of the transparency regulation. This doesn't mean that applications that were submitted before are not subject to confidentiality requirements or to the possibility that applicants request the confidential treatment of certain information. Simply the procedure and the competences are different. For what concerns application falling under the transparency regulation, the new practical arrangements adopted by EFSA to implement Article 39(d)(5) and 38(1) of the transparency of the General Food Laws amended by the transparency regulation apply. Similarly, the standard operating procedure that were developed by EFSA also apply. And more in general, the Article 39 to 39E of the General Food Law are relevant in this regard. In practical terms, this means that an applicant will see the proactive disclosure of information that is submitted as part of the application dossier, or in particular cases also of a notification dossier, whenever EFSA is consulted, and that's extremely important, because when EFSA is not consulted, as I was anticipating, the competence of the confidentiality decision-making rests with the European Commission. And then also information that is submitted to support an application for authorization of a traditional food from a third country following the rejection of the notification by the European Commission. In all these cases, the information supporting these documents will be proactively disclosed by EFSA in the non-confidential version submitted by the applicant. So it is very important that whenever you're submitting an application dossier, you take your time and consider exactly the information that you will not see, you will not want to see disclosed proactively by EFSA. Failure to do so will result in the automated disclosure at the moment when the application is considered valid. Only in case you submit a confidentiality request and the confidentiality request is submitted regularly, this information will not be disclosed by EFSA at the moment of validation of the application, and the confidentiality decision making on that confidentiality request will start. Following the confidentiality decision making, EFSA then will take a decision, taking a final position on the confidentiality request submitted by the applicant. It should be highlighted that confidentiality requests may be submitted successfully only on the items that are appearing on the closed positive list of that you will find in Article 23 of the Novel Food Regulation, and also in the annex to the EFSA's practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality. It's also very important to highlight that confidentiality requests may be validly submitted only when substantive and procedural requirements as set out in the practical arrangements by EFSA are met. So again, it's very important that we understand that the transparency regulation implied a distinct change when it comes to transparency and to the relationship between transparency and confidentiality. Transparency has become the rule, and all the information that is submitted supporting an application dossier is to be made proactively available by EFSA, while confidentiality is an exception to transparency and becomes relevant only under certain conditions specified in the General Food Law and, for this case, Article 23 of the Novel Food Regulation, as further detailed in EFSA's practical arrangements concerning transparency and confidentiality. Again, very important to understand that the burden of proof for submitting a successful confidentiality request relies entirely on the applicant, which means that unless you meet all the requirements, your confidentiality request will be rejected by EFSA, and consequently, the information on which the confidentiality request was submitted will be also disclosed at the end of the confidentiality decision-making process. Pending the confidentiality decision-making process, EFSA will not disclose the information that has been claimed confidential. Applicants can submit confidentiality requests both directly and also via public authorities in certain cases, and this is relevant, for instance, for what concerns notifications from third countries. For what concerns the procedural requirements that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we have to say that the submission should happen via the ESFC platform, and EFSA will assess the confidentiality request via Appian, which is an internal workflow for the assessment of confidentiality request. The confidentiality request and each and every confidentiality request must include verifiable justification, as well as we have seen, a confidential and non-confidential version of the document that is claimed confidential, or that it's anyway including information claimed confidential. To be noted that the non-confidential version must include the information claimed confidential in a fully blackened form, so as not to make it available to the public, while the confidential version must include all information in a visible format, possibly boxed and or earmarked, so as to facilitate the identification of this information that is claimed confidential by the applicant, by EFSA staff and EFSA's experts. To be highlighted that the applicant has the possibility of submitting or clarifying confidentiality requests submitted together with the application dossier only if requested to do so by EFSA, which means that it may not be modify. It may not modify confidentiality requests submitted initially together with the application, unless EFSA empowers the applicant to do so. Therefore, once again, please provide all the requested information as set out in the practical arrangements, substantive requirements at the beginning of the process together with the application dossier. You will not be asked, however, to provide any financial contribution for the processing of the confidentiality request. As I was anticipating before, the confidentiality request may be successfully submitted only on items that are apparent and present in the close positive list set out in Article 23 of the Novel Foods Regulation. Article 23 in turn refers also to items set out in Article 39, paragraph 2 of the General Food Law, and you can see listed also on this slide just for ease of reference. Obviously, this material does not replace the applicable provisions. As you will see, and you will notice reading this positive list, some of these items, notably those mentioned in Article 23, paragraph 4, letter A, letter B, are relevant and valid only to the extent that the information is not relevant for the assessment of safety, which means that as soon as information that is present on this list becomes relevant for the assessment of the safety of the food in question, a confidentiality request submitted with regard to this information will most likely be rejected. Also to be highlighted, and this is also linking up to some of the questions that we received in writing in the chat, in the live chat. The transparency regulation requires applicant to submit a non-confidential version of the application that is therefore to be made practically available by EFSA at the moment of validation without intervention, which means that if there is personal data in your application, you are requested to blacken, to sanitize it, and to submit confidentiality requests in this regard. There are exceptions which are listed in this slide and also in Article 39E of the General Food Laws amended by the Transparency Regulation, and notably these are the name and address of the applicant, as well as the names of authors of published or publicly available studies, as well as the names of the participants to scientific committee and scientific panels, although the latter category is obviously less relevant for what concerns the content of an application dossier. Whenever a confidentiality request is submitted, we mention the fact that it should also be supported by verifiable justification. In practical terms, this verifiable justification must include the identification of the information claimed confidential, possibly with references to the pages and parts of the application where this is to be found. You're also requested to indicate the legal ground, the legal basis for the confidentiality request, that is the item on the close positive list that, according to you, this information relates to. Obviously, this is not binding on EFSA, but it's a clear indication that is extremely relevant. And then you should also be explaining as an applicant why the item in question should be kept confidential, should remain confidential. And in this regard, you should confirm that the information is not in the public domain, because obviously if it's already publicly available, a confidentiality request in this regard may not be successfully submitted. And then you have also to confirm that in case the information in question is disclosed by EFSA, it would result in a potential harm to a significant degree to the legal situation of the applicant. And this is to be clarified with regard to, let's say, three different criteria, two of which are rebuttable presumptions. That is, if you confirm that the disclosure will result in a harm which is not negligible and therefore which exceeds the 5% of the turnover of the legal person or the 5% of the annual earnings of the natural person who is submitting the application of the applicant. And you're also confirming that the information in question is not older than 5 years from counting from the date of submission of the information to EFSA, then and that the information has been acquired in a legitimate manner, and that this has not been acquired in an unlawful manner, this will be regarded as indeed confirming that the potential harm test has been is successful. While if this confirmation is not possible, you will be asked to provide a clarification with regard to the reason why, in your specific case, with regard to the information that is claimed confidential for that confidentiality request, the disclosure of the information would anyway result in a potential harm to a significant degree to the legal situation of the person, of the applicant. Last but not least, you're also asked to clarify on whether if the information claimed confidential is falling within under the concept and definition of environmental information set out in Article 2 of the ARUS regulation. Once a confidentiality request has been submitted by an applicant, as we anticipated, it is subject to an assessment by EFSA. The assessment by EFSA implies that EFSA looks at the confidentiality request, at the justification, verifies its compliance with the practical arrangements, and then draws up a draft decision on the confidentiality request. This draft decision is shared with the applicant for a mandatory consultation that is lasting for 2 weeks. And within this timeline, the applicant has the possibility of submitting comments on the draft decision or of withdrawing the application dossier. Once the comments are submitted or no comments are submitted, the EFSA is then finalizing the draft decision, which becomes final. It is signed and is shared with the applicant. It is notified to the applicant. In the following 2 weeks from the notification, the applicant, if they receive a negative decision, has the possibility of submitting a confirmatory application. This confirmatory application is to be submitted via the ESFC, or in case of unavailability of this feature, by email to the functional mailbox shown on this slide. Once this confirmatory application is submitted, EFSA will also draw up a confidentiality decision that will be shared then, once finalized and signed, with the applicant after submission, and then the confidentiality decision will be implemented in case when it concludes for the rejection of certain or all the confidentiality requests submitted by the applicants. What does it mean? The implementation means that EFSA will intervene on the documents submitted by the applicant and will sanitize or unblacken relevant parts of the application dossier in accordance with its own confidentiality decision. EFSA will then re-upload these documents sanitized in accordance with the confidentiality decision in its internal workflows, and will have them publicly available, will make them publicly available on the Open EFSA portal. This means that the overall outcome of the confidentiality decision-making process may be the disclosure of the information initially claimed confidential by the applicant. Even so, when after the confirmatory application, EFSA, for instance, may accept certain confidentiality requests regarding relevant information, there may also be the case when after the adoption of a scientific output adopted by EFSA, EFSA identifies in its scientific output foreseeable effects on human health, animal health, or the environment. In this case, EFSA will reopen the confidentiality decision-making process. The confidentiality will look again at the confidentiality decision and will restart the entire confidentiality decision-making process, inclusive of the mandatory consultation on a draft confidentiality decision, and with the aim of making proactively available information that is relevant, that is related to the effects on human health, animal health, or the environment that have been identified in its scientific output. Again, so once more, it is extremely important to submit fully reasoned justifications with regard to each and every confidentiality request that you're submitting to support your application, and that these verifiable justifications are in line with EFSA's practical arrangements. With this, I've concluded, and I give the floor back to Karin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we are back in the workflow of the application. I'm projecting the presentation now to move to the phase of the public consultation that is taking place once the decision on confidentiality has been issued. So what type of public consultation? We have several types of public consultation that are performed in EFSA. And what we are going to discuss today is the last one, the non-confidentiality version of a valid application. So we are showing you the flow of an application, and here we're taking a new application that, that is validated. So we have seen on step number 1, an application is submitted. We might have confidentiality. We have had a presentation with Simone on the confidentiality assessment, and we are now in step 3, where the public consultation is launched. So the aim of the public consultation, it's really based on the transparency regulation with the concept of transparency, and this is to collect new or additional evidence, data or information to assess the application. So it's happening after the confidentiality assessment of the dossier. It has a duration of 3 calendar weeks. And then from the report of the outcome of the publication of, from the outcome of the public consultation, there's 2 steps. One is the publication of the third-party comments that are published on OpenEFSA straight after the public consultation. So there's visibility on all the comments that have been received. Then the comments are also going to the working group in step number 5. They are discussed and assessed by the working group during their assessment, and they are published as an annex to the opinion, including the outcome of the public consultation. So here, 2 types of outcome that is coming from the publication with different timing. Where can you go to contribute to the public consultation and participate? This is again on the Connect EFSA portal. You will have a green box on public consultation where are listed all the public consultation plan in advance, running and closed. So this is the way to get information. Now I will have few slides to go to the next step, which are covering the risk assessment, the adoption and the publication. Not a lot of changes, so not a lot of new information. So there's a preparation of the first draft of the scientific output by the working group. We might have, the working group might have a need to complement and to request additional data. The novelty here is if this additional data submitted via the electronic submission food chain contain confidential information, we will have an assessment of these confidentiality claims. Then the draft scientific output move to a finalization, and finally an endorsement, an adoption by the scientific panel. At the level of publication, we notified when an opinion is adopted. So this is in our catalog of services. Then we also have an editorial check and final editing of the opinion. We pre-notify the scientific output, and then it's published on the website. And here it's published with the supporting evidence. So here it's complemented. One of them, for example, is the annex with the comments of the public consultation and how they have been considered by the panel. So additional evidence published. The last box is not desirable if it's in case we need to modify after publication and make a correction, but it's not a step we would like to encounter. So with this slide, we have gone through all the presentation. We have gone through the life cycle of an application on novel food. We have some questions here, but perhaps Margherita will give you back the floor to see if we have questions that have been submitted today during the chat that we want to address. And if time remains, we could go to the one that anyway will be published, the one that we have in the presentation. So if it's okay, Margherita, I will give you back the floor, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Karim. I will now project our presentation. We are almost at the end of the webinar. We will start now 5 minutes delayed with the the Q&A session. And for handling this, I'd like to call on stage with me a few colleagues. And the first one that I would call is Simone. If you can join me on stage.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Simone. I will read a few questions that have been submitted throughout the webinar for you, and maybe we can collect all of them in the area that you are following so that you can answer to them all in one. So the first one that I have is when uploading documentation as part of a novel food application, what does it mean in tail 2, digitally scrub confidential content and to black out its placements?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Margherita. This is also a question that I had replied to in the written chat initially, and it's very important to clarify that whenever a confidentiality request is submitted, a document which is called the non-confidential version of the document should be submitted to support the confidentiality request, together with another version of the same document, which is called the confidential version. So we have two versions of the same document that must be submitted by the applicant. One which must have all the information included and fully visible, possibly boxed or earmarked in order to allow EFSA staff and EFSA's experts to immediately spot the information that is claimed confidential. However, the information must be visible to allow EFSA experts and staff to work on it, to consider it, for instance, for the risk assessment process. This is the confidential version of the document. The non-confidential version of the document is the version as submitted by the applicant that will be made proactively available by EFSA once the application is considered valid. EFSA will be making publicly available the non-confidential version as is submitted by the applicant. So it is extremely important that applicants take their time in identifying items they wish to claim confidential and they wish to protect from public disclosure. Because if no confidentiality request is submitted with regard to certain item or information, that item or information will be made proactively available. Thank you.
Thank you, Simone. Please stay on stage. And I read now the following one, which is EFSA planning to publish specific guidance for cellular agricultural products as novel foods? What approach does EFSA recommend to assess toxicology of alternative proteins and cell-based meat products?
Thank you. I believe this question relates actually to the substance of the novel food scientific advice, and therefore is not addressed specifically in the context of this webinar, where we focus rather on the let's say clarifications and presentation and training regarding the new processes set out by the Transparency Regulation. You will find more information on specific guidance documents on EFSA's website, and in particular in the web page related to the novel food regulation.
Many thanks, Simone. Indeed, while I was reading it, I could have actually replied myself, but many thanks for your very extensive answer. I'll go back to the more related confidentiality issues type of questions for you, and this one would be for publications already available to the public upon payment of fees, for which the applicant does not have or cannot obtain intellectual property rights. The applicant must provide a copy of the relevant publications along with the relevant bibliographic references and citations, and in the confidential version of its application. So the question in this case is, could you clarify if you're asking applicants to share scientific publications for which the applicant do not have a license to share?
Thank you, Margherita. And this is also an extremely important question, which allows me to clarify one fundamental aspect. First of all, the transparency regulation did not change or alter the data submission requirements that are relevant for each sector. And also, this is also valid for the novel food sector. Secondly, so nothing changes with regard to this particular aspect. Secondly, it is true, EFSA is asking the applicants to submit copies of studies and reports, and it is for the applicant to secure the appropriate rights for regulatory use, that is, for use by regulatory authorities. This is a particular category of rights, which is certainly less expensive compared to other rights, for instance, rights for full disclosure. And the EFSA, the requirement to indicate whether IP rights for disclosure are held by the applicant or not relates specifically to the second kind of, let's say, right. That is, whether the applicants holds the rights compatible with the full disclosure proactively done by EFSA in accordance with Article 38, Paragraph 1, letter C of the Regulation 178 of 2002, the General Food Law. In other words, we are asking applicants to indicate whether for publications that are already available to the public upon payment of a fee, and only for this particular kind of publications, you hold the disclosure, the rights to ensure a compliant and legally sound disclosure by EFSA. If it is the case or it is not the case. If it's not the case, please indicate that, and EFSA will not disclose the copy of the study submitted to its attention. However, you're asked also to indicate in that case the full reference, bibliographic reference, where the article or publication may be found. And this reference will be made publicly available by EFSA so that an interested third party may look it up autonomously and may get access to this publication in the appropriate manner. Thank you.
Thank you again, Simone. I have a couple of questions more for you, so if you can stay with me again. The next one from Rosalia is in the e-submission platform, when choosing the option for the publicly available, the consequence for choosing yes, IPR not owned makes little sense to Rosalia. So it is explained that the applicant still is required to share a copy of a publication, even if he does not have or cannot obtain rights for such distribution. So the question is if you could explain and describe further what EFSA expects, and the purchased scientific publication will be marked as confidential. She's also asking, what about the publicly available scientific publication? Will EFSA publish them, full papers, with the non-confidential version of the dossier?
Thank you for this question, which again is extremely important to clarify another aspect, which is the fact that if there is a scientific publication which is publicly available, obviously, since the publication is in the public domain, it cannot be subject to a successful confidentiality request. As we have seen, one of the requirements, substantive requirements that you have to comply with in order to submit a successful confidentiality request is the confirmation that the information claimed confidential is not in the public domain. Therefore, obviously, this is not possible for a scientific publication publicly available, which means that for publications that are in the public domain and that are subject to a payment of a fee, EFSA and the Commission give the applicant the option of indicating whether they hold intellectual property rights or not, compatible with a full proactive disclosure by EFSA. If they do so, EFSA will be disclosing the publication in question. If they don't hold these intellectual property rights compatible with full public disclosure, you will be asked to indicate a full bibliographic reference that will be subject then to the public disclosure and replacing the publication, the hard copy of the publication. So this will effectively withhold the copy of the publication from public disclosure. Thank you.
Thank you again, Simone. And now a very last one for you, a short one. So the question is coming from Paul, and he's asking, how should the copyright be handled for published articles?
Thank you, Margherita. Thank you, Paul. Again, I believe we addressed this point already in the previous questions. Let's say in a nutshell, because this could be a PhD thesis on its own, but in a nutshell, for public, the applicants remains completely responsible for securing the appropriate intellectual property rights and copyrights for each and every of the studies that it shares with EFSA. This implies, first and foremost, the securing of intellectual property rights for regulatory use, and possibly also for public disclosure, so as to make it compatible with Article 38, paragraph 1, letter C of the General Food Law, as we already discussed. If, however, this is not done, the applicant will have the possibility of flagging the option IPR not owned for what concerns scientific publications available upon payment of a fee. If this is the option chosen by the applicant, as we have seen, the applicant will be asked to submit a clarification with regard to the bibliographic reference where the publication in question may be found. I believe this addresses also this last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, and I'd like now to call on stage Anastasia for another question, and I'll read it aloud for everybody. The user is asking, I want to submit a novel food application for a novel food that has already been authorized based on data protection, and I have reached an agreement with the original applicant to use the protected data. What would I have to select in the application portal? Over to you, Anastasia.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Let me now share my screen for a moment to support the answer for this question. So here, as indeed you have the person who placed the question has rightly indicated, most likely you were suggesting that we will have to submit an application for a modification. So in fact, in this selection menu, here you would need to select the option modification of an already authorized novel food. As soon as you do that, there is a fourth step here. And in this case, you will need to select which is the already authorized novel food that you wish to modify. So let's take one as an example. So as soon as you start the process, now this template will be slightly adjusted to support the requirements for a modification application. So you will notice that you do not, you're not required to submit any information on the name anymore, because you have already selected the already authorized novel food. And further below, you have the option to select what type of application, what's the scope of your modification. So you have 4 options. The options are to modify the conditions of use, the specifications, the labeling requirements, or the post-market monitoring requirements. And since you've mentioned that perhaps this novel food might already have data protection from the already existing authorization, in this section here in the data protection, you will click on yes, and in here below that you are invited to provide appropriate and verifiable information as regards compliance with the conditions laid down, blah, 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 on 26.2 of the Novel Foods Regulation that defines the data protection requirements. Here, you can upload the document with the agreement you have with the holder of the data protection. And as a document type here, you can select, so if it loads very soon, so there's the option in the document types to select access letter, data sharing agreement. So in this case, you would select that option. Let me show you. Data sharing agreement access letter. And you can also upload any other document that might be necessary in this case. Thank you, Margherita. Back to you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I will now kindly ask Remigio to come on stage for a question on the general pre-submission advice. This question is coming from Claude. Maybe Anastasia, you can stop projecting your presentation if you want. And Remigio, for you, the question is, can it be, can a person request several general pre-submission advice for the same dossier?
Thank you, Margherita, and good morning, everyone. So as set in the EFSA practical arrangement on pre-submission phase and public consultation, each potential applicant shall submit questions in the form of one single request per pre-application ID. So we really invite potential applicant to combine all the questions in one request. However, up to 2 requests per pre-application ID may be submitted, providing that the questions are not repeating the ones already submitted. I also take the occasion to remind that general pre-submission advice can be requested at any time before submitting the application. Thank you, Margherita.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. Sorry, I got distracted a bit with my mouse. Okay, I have a last question, and for this one, I would kindly ask Karin to come on stage. And this question is, I will read it aloud for you, Karin. If a study ID is obtained under TR, do we always have to attach a report? This person is asking because sometimes the document data in a dossier comes without a separate report. Over to you.
Thank you, Margherita. The question is about we advise in EFSA to send all the data that are available to allow the expert to do a proper risk assessment. So providing an ID number only is not sufficient. ID numbers is a way to retrieve a study, perhaps years after, to identify a study, but the data set needs to be provided in the dossier. So we would really encourage all area as a general line, always most complete dossier as possible, and the expert can do a good work with all the data.
Thank you very much, Karin. I think we went through all the different questions that we had coming from our audience, many of which have been already replied in written throughout the webinar. So we hope that we managed to reply to all your questions. As I was mentioning at the beginning of the webinar, if we haven't managed to answer all your questions, we suggest you to resubmit them via the Ask a Question tool available from EFSA website. Since we are almost at the end of the webinar, I'd like to inform you, give you this news about a recent launch of a LinkedIn group that we have actually launched this week, the 20th of September. It's called Fsa Support to Applicants, and in this LinkedIn group, we are planning to give information and support materials to our applicants, updates on the developments and progresses of IT tools and platforms, but also alerts on new training materials as well as events. If you are already part of the group, you've seen that we have informed about this webinar today. We are also planning to provide answers to the most frequently asked questions, as we have done already today via this webinar, but also with all the various questions that we receive via different channels in EFSA. And of course, it would also be a space for you where you can seek clarification from your peers, since we realize several times questions coming from different applicants and users are very similar. So it's definitely a place where you can also share experiences and provide answers to each other. And with this one, I'd like to thank you very much for attending our webinar. As mentioned, you can resubmit questions via the Ask a Question tool. As I was already mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, this webinar is recorded, so you will be able to review the questions and answers via the link that will be available on the event page where the registration was for this webinar. And very final, if you have a few seconds, we would appreciate your feedback via this evaluation form that you will receive in your inbox shortly after the webinar. And your feedback is really important for us to understand whether we're going towards the right direction, and if you like it, or if you have any ideas or improvements area that you would like to suggest to us. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention and the interaction today. I thank all the speakers and the Q&A contributors for the great work they have been doing for this 1.5 hour webinar. And I see you soon for the next webinar advertised on our website. Thank you very much and goodbye.